Not all his servants and chattels are wraiths. There are orcs and trolls, there are wargs and werewolves, and there have been and still are many men, warriors and kings, that walk alive under the sun, yet are under his sway. And Sauron proved even more skillful than his master also in the corruption of men who were beyond the reach of the wise, and in reducing them to a vassalage, in which they would march with the orcs, and vie with them in cruelty and destruction. Throughout the stories of J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium and Peter Jackson's adaptations, we have come to associate Sauron's servants with the evil things of the days of Morgoth, yet many peoples of wicked men were also represented in his armies. Recently I've had requests on Quora to answer the following questions. Why did the Easterlings, the Dunlandings and the Haradrim fight for the Dark Lord? As we shall see, of the Eruhini, the children of Ilúvatar, men proved to be the most susceptible to temptations, vices, as well as to corruption by Morgoth, and especially Sauron. Let us start with the Easterlings, a term used for the many savage tribes in the east that were loyal servants of Sauron. The men of the Alliance were involved in war not only with orcs, but with alien men of evil sort. For Sauron had acquired dominion over many savage tribes in the east, of old corrupted by Morgoth, and he now urged them to seek land and booty in the west. Now the Easterlings' alignment with the Dark Powers stretched back to the First Age, when Easterlings, later known as the Incomers, served Sauron's former liege Morgoth, and overran Hithlum to plunder and harass the old and the women and the children of Hador's people. Thus, Sauron inherited dominion over many of the eastern peoples that came to live in future Rhûn. Sauron, though, achieved a greater control over them than Morgoth had done, and had a far more lasting influence over them. More ominous were rumors from the further east. The wild men were restless. Former servants and worshippers of Sauron, they were released now from his tyranny, but not from the evil and darkness he had set in their hearts. Cruel wars raged among them, from which some were withdrawing westward, with minds filled with hatred, regarding all that dwelt in the west as enemies to be slain and plundered. Even when their Dark Master was defeated in the War of the Last Alliance, the Easterlings were not freed from the evil that he had nurtured in their hearts. Even though, bereft of his will, they squabbled at first among themselves, they retained their deep hatred for his enemies, the free peoples in the west, and most importantly, did not flinch in their allegiance to him. The moment Sauron's steady re-emergence began, they were gone back to his service, with eastern confederations like the Wainwrights and their Balkoth descendants being under the shadow of Dol Guldur. The Easterlings were not exposed to the teaching of the elves about Ilúvatar and the Valar like the men of the west were. Their faith was probably far more based on superstition and concrete miracles than that of the Gondorians and their Númenórean ancestors. Instead, they had witnessed the power of Sauron, who was an immortal angelic spirit, and being both afraid and in awe of him, began to worship him and build him temples. To them, Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. As I said before, the tribes in the east were savage and primitive compared to the more civilized free folk in the west, which extended beyond faith to craftsmanship and their very living conditions, not to mention the wasteland that Rhûn was. Therefore, they envied the prosperity these peoples had achieved and coveted their fertile lands. It was in fact whispers of the riches in the realm of Beleriand that Morgoth had used to ensnare the Easterlings in the First Age, but he later denied them their reward and sent them to Hithlum instead. This is probably where the difference between Morgoth and Sauron played a vital role in the greater sway Sauron held over the Easterlings. But his capability of corrupting other minds and even engaging their service was a residue from the fact that his original desire for order had really envisaged the good estate, especially physical well-being, of his subjects. Sauron's capability to engage the service of others was a byproduct of his passion for order, and his own delusions of grandeur. He fancied himself the lord of the earth, and he sought to have an unopposed eternal reign and receive the veneration of his subjects, both of which were directly tied to the well-being of said subjects. Under the Dark Lord, the Easterlings began to experience growth. They built temples, walls, and cities, and were now armed with iron. When Sauron invaded Eriador in the Second Age, he encouraged the Easterlings to join him, to take their share of booty and land by force from the alliance of dwarves and men in the north. Similar promises led to future incursions by the Easterlings into the lands of the men of Gondor and Rhovanion in the Third Age. It was his apparent way of rewarding, or pretending to reward, that cemented the Easterling status as loyal servants of Sauron, to the point that they gladly marched to war on his behalf. Indeed, one of their kings, named Khamûl, had been granted by Sauron a special gift, one of 9 rings of power, through which the king became one of the Ringwraiths, the most terrible servants of the Dark Lord, bound to his will. Of course, the Easterlings' savagery extended to bloodthirstiness as well, seeing as they warred among themselves just as well, when not united by the central will of their master. And they had no qualms, especially when it came to shedding the blood of others. The Dark Lord had managed to instill such a hatred and cynicism in them that the Easterlings regarded the free peoples of the West as little more than easy pickings or livestock for them to enslave, rob, or slay. It is worth mentioning, though, that not all Easterlings were servants of Sauron. Some had rebelled against him, or had already rejected Morgoth. The Valar were aware of this, and that is why 2 members of the Order of Istari, the Blue Wizards, were sent far into eastern lands. But the other 2 Istari were sent for a different purpose: Morinehtar and Romestamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper. Their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and after his first fall, to search out his hiding, in which they failed, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. They must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who both in the Second Age and Third Age could otherwise have outnumbered the West. Concerning the Haradrim, or Southrons, most of the reasons for which the Easterlings served Sauron can be applied to them as well. But there was something else in addition to greed and envy and savagery: revenge. When Sauron's emissaries visited the tribes, the Haradrim would have needed little persuading to ally with him. Sauron's great skill was knowing how to appeal to people's base desires. He would have offered Gondor's fertile lands in exchange for their loyalty. Of course, they would have been looking for vengeance, well remembering how the Númenóreans ruled them mercilessly. The Haradrim were among those primitive peoples that the Gondorians' ancestors, the Númenóreans, came across during their voyages to Middle-earth. At first, the men of the sea came among the natives as friends and helpers, teaching them agriculture and architecture. When Númenor began to colonize the coast of Middle-earth many years later, however, its attitude had changed. The Númenóreans, chiefly those belonging to the King's men, began to behave more as oppressive rulers than as benefactors, while also demanding heavy tribute from peoples such as the Haradrim. The Dark Lord used this to his advantage and gathered the Southrons to his service. But in truth, Harad had merely replaced the dominion of Númenor with that of Mordor. Following the downfall of Númenor, some of the Haradrim found themselves under the rule of Black Númenóreans, King's men who had hearkened to Sauron and now served him in Middle-earth. With the Dark Lord's defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, some of the Haradrim became subject to the heirs of Elendil, but enough of them kept the memory of Sauron in their hearts and were still hostile to the Númenóreans. The men of the Vales of Anduin acknowledged his authority, and the kings of Harad did homage to Gondor, and their sons lived as hostages in the court of its king. This renewed obedience to the Númenóreans and their Gondorian descendants only intensified the Haradrim's hatred of them. Besides tribute, the rulers of Harad now had to hand over their own sons to the king of Gondor as prisoners in the royal court. As soon as Sauron regained his strength, the Haradrim eagerly rebelled and began to strike against the Gondorians and, guided by Sauron's servants, often joined forces with the Easterlings and the Corsairs of Umbar.